Hey, didn't see you there. Welcome to Ragtime Customs. This is orange peel. Orange peel is bad. This is what happens to orange peel after it's been wet sanded. And this is what happens after you've compounded and polished a wet sanded area. This is a customer's 3100 Chevy pickup. This is what the paint has looked like for at least the decade that he has owned it. You'll see it has a lot of surface scratching, contaminants, some spot fixes, and worst of all, some of the worst orange peel I've ever seen. This is a single stage paint job, most likely one of those $3.99 specials from 20 years ago. I'm going to give this truck a much needed shining up while showing you the very basics of color sanding and buffing. So if you have a cheap paint job, an old paint job, just don't like the factory peel on your vehicle, or you want to get your car painted but can only afford a cheap paint job, but you're also willing to finish it out yourself, then you've come to the right video. The driver's side hood, fender, and door are already done just to help show the difference. You can see here the shine of the door versus the cowl, which hasn't been touched yet. So assuming you have an air supply, you're going to need a black foam polishing pad for polishing. You're going to need a wool cutting pad for compound. You'll need a buffer, and you'll need your sandpaper. Here we're going to start with 1500 and then just simply go to 3000. You'll need a palm sander with a soft pad that goes in between your sandpaper and your sander. And what this does is provide a little bit of a cushion to help prevent you from going into any edges or some of the round spots on a car. In this case, the whole truck is round. For a compound and polish, I'm going to be using the Meguiar's that you can find at any auto parts store. And you also want to make sure you have a water bottle that's filled with water. The main reason that I started with pictures in the beginning of this video is that this camera makes this truck look a lot better than it really is. Even though right now it doesn't look that great, imagine it about 10 times worse, which is why I provided those pictures. The fender has a lot of stains, a lot of contaminants in it. Like I said previously, there's been some repairs. There's a huge scratch that got touched up with what looks like nail polish at some point. So obviously we're not going to be able to fix these, but at least getting the paint smoothed out is going to make this truck look a lot better. Just keep in mind that the goal on this truck is just to be a nice driver and not a show vehicle. Alright, let's get started. Step 1, spray down the area you're going to color sand. You want to make sure to keep the area wet so that it doesn't 1, eat up the paper, or 2, eat up the panel. Next, you've got a brand new piece of paper, so you want to make sure you get that wet too so that it doesn't dry up the fender, eat up the sandpaper, and the panel. Now it's time to start sanding, so be very careful when you're first starting out, especially if you do not know what type of paint is on the vehicle, who painted it, how many coats of clear are on it, or in this case no clear because it's single stage. This is when you're going to start finding out what type of paint job you're working with. Notice the water coming off of this truck is an orangey red color. That's because this is a single stage paint job. If it were a two-stage paint job, then the water would be more of a white color to show that it's clear coat coming off. So if the truck's red, why is the water orange? Well, that's how dead this top coat of paint is. You'll actually notice in the final pictures of this that the areas that weren't sanded and buffed actually look orange compared to the red the truck is supposed to be. Make sure to keep the area clean. Stop sanding, get a damp microfiber, and wipe it down. What's happening is, as you're sanding this, any dirt that was in the paint or any contaminants from over the years can get stuck on both the panel and the sandpaper, and it'll actually start sanding little scratches into the panel, which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. So this is about what it'll look like after being sanded with 1500. You can still see little imperfections in here. You're going to want to hit those by hand very carefully and then go back over it with the palm sander. When sanding, follow the body. So up here across the top, I'm going to go front to back because that's a fairly flat area. But then I'm going to go down around the sides of these fenders, following the contour so that I'm not cutting grooves into it. The problem is if I went from front to back instead of side to side, going up and over the fender, you're going to start cutting little grooves into that rounded area, and eventually you're going to burn through it. You also don't want the air hose to go and start slapping against the panel, so make sure you tuck it over your shoulder to keep it away from the panel, because all that hose is going to do is start banging against this fender and put more scratches into it. That's counterproductive to what we're doing. So as I get closer to this headlight ring, it's going to look like the sandpaper is actually touching it. It isn't. But on your vehicle or whatever you're fixing, if you're worried about stainless trim, any chrome pieces, anything about accidentally hitting it with a sander, just cover it up with a piece of masking tape. Now I'm not cleaning off the area fully, I'm just wetting it down, and that's to make sure that I'm not gumming up the sandpaper, and also keeping this plenty wet to just keep cutting into it and not ruining any paint surface. So now I'm going to clean off my panel so I can check my progress. I'm going to use a damp microfiber, go across it to get all the dead paint off of the fender, and then I'll go back over it one more time with a dry microfiber, and then once the water's all dried up, I can take a look and check for any scratches that could have been left behind by the 1500 grit sandpaper. So now that it's dry, I'm going to check for two things, and that is how thick is the orange peel. I'm not sanding all of the orange peel off. I'm leaving just a little bit of peel so it looks a little bit more like a factory finish. But then I'm also checking for any small sand swirl marks, because if there's any sandpaper marks, then I know I have to go back over it some more with the 1500 and clean up anything that may have gotten stuck in between the paint or the pad. Now here by the headlight ring, you'll see there's an area that didn't get hit with the 1500. So I'm going to come at it with the 1500, but then when I go to 3000, I'm going to go all the way to the edge. If the 3000 kind of touches a little bit of the chrome, it's fine, because you're going to polish it out, and it'll actually kind of help polish it anyways. If you're worried about hitting anything, once again, just use some masking tape and tape up the area that you don't want to damage. So now that the orange peel is where I want it, and there aren't any sand scratches in the paint, it's time to switch to the 3000. Now, I used to go 1000, then 2000, then 3000, or I'd go 1500, then 2500, then 3000. When using these soft pads like this on a sanding disc, I don't really feel a need to have to go through as many steps as I would when I used to have to do all this by hand. The 3000 on a palm sander works so well that it'll definitely get the 1000 or the 1500 grit sand scratches out of the paint, and then it's going to bring it to a very good sheen that makes it very easy to buff out when it's done. You'll notice now I'm getting a lot more brave with this headlight ring now that I'm using the 3000 grit, which is fine. Once again, if you don't want to hit anything, tape it up. You'll also see that I'm following the contours of the body, working up and over the roundness of the fender. Even though this doesn't cut as hard as the 1500 will, you want to maintain the shape of whatever you're working on so that you get a nice even cut. Okay, so now that I've worked this area with the 3000 grit, I'm going to finish sanding here, and then I'm going to clean off my area, and then once it's all cleaned up and dried, I'll show you the difference between what 1500 grit looks like versus 3000. Now going up the fender, you'll see the 3000 grit. and then you'll see where it stops and it's still the 1500. You can see it's more hazy in this area here. That's your 1500 grit. Then as you pull back, you'll see that the 3000 has a little bit more of a sheen to it, which is nice in the fact that it's going to make cutting it with the compound a lot easier. So whether you have a new pad or an old pad, you have to clean the pad. Even if it's new, you still want to clean it, and you're going to notice a lot of wool shooting off of it. That's all stuff that would get in between your sandpaper and the panel that you're fixing. I just use a car key instead of a tool, and I have the shiniest keys out of all of my friends. So now it's time to start cutting it with some compound. So when you first remove the cap, because it's likely clogged, you want to put a lot of product onto whatever it is that you're working on. This is because not only is that area dry, but so is the buffer, because you haven't started buffing yet. So put the cord up and over your shoulder so you don't touch the fender with it, and then try to get as much compound on that wool pad as possible. You can even take it off. You can take some and smear it all around, go back over it, smear it some more. Just make sure you have plenty of compound on the pad before you start buffing it out. Now remember how that 3000 grit left a little bit of a sheen. That means you do not need to lean on this buffer. You're not putting a whole lot of weight into it. The 3000's job was to clean up the scratches from the 1500 grit. The compound's job is to get rid of the scratches left behind from the 3000 grit. The 3000 doesn't really leave a whole lot of scratches, therefore you don't have to put a lot of weight onto the panel as you're buffing it. Just let the buffer do its job, let the compound move around and clean up the scratches. Now if you've never buffed before, not only are you going to likely want to tape up something like this headlight trim ring, but you're also going to want to tape up that hood. Just run a piece of masking tape against the edge of the hood so you don't accidentally hit it with the buffer and either burn through the paint or actually remove paint from the hood. What I'm going to do is get really close to it, because I've been doing this for a long time and I am fairly confident in the control over my buffer, but I'm also not going to go all the way to the end of that edge. What I'll end up doing is popping the hood, and then I'll go across it with the buffer that way with the hood out of the way, so I make sure I'm not going to hit the hood. So any panels you have that are very close to each other, be very careful of the buffer, and if you're not that confident about it, just hit it with a piece of tape, and the tape is going to protect that edge. Now that I've got the shine into this fender, I'm just going back across it, getting rid of any compound that got left behind. I'm putting no weight on this buffer whatsoever. I'm just kind of dusting it right across just to remove the compound and get any little last second scratches out that I can. And then I'll clean this all up, and then I'll check my work. Using a damp microfiber, clean off any compound that might have gotten left behind, and then follow that with a dry microfiber and wipe down the panel so you can take a look at what you've done so far. Now for the best part, and that's the polish. Now you're not going to need as much polish as you did compound. A little bit of polish goes a long way. Once again, make sure the cord is up around your shoulder so you're not smacking it against the fender and causing more scratches. So now that you're polishing, you're not working with anything that is at all abrasive. So it's a little more forgiving. If you kind of cut an edge a little too hard, it's not really going to burn through it as easily as a wool pad with compound. You also want to make sure not to put too much polish on the area you're working on. If you have too much polish on there, what can happen is it will dry out before you can buff it out, and then anything that's trapped underneath that residue is not going to get polished. So make sure if you have any dried polish residue you go and get a damp microfiber, wipe it off, and then repolish that area. Is anybody else watching how close my keys get to this fender? Take your keys off. Just a little reminder of how bad it was. So now as I start on the hood, there's a few things that I just want to remind you. One, keep the area you're working on nice and wet. Keep the sandpaper wet as well. Also, follow the contours of the body. Don't cut lines into round edges. Also, don't go and cut hard edges with the middle of your sandpaper as well. Follow the body, pay attention to what you're doing, make sure you don't hit anything incorrectly or hit anything that you shouldn't be hitting. Keep the area that you're working on nice and clean. Get all that dead paint out of your way. Do whatever you have to do to keep hoses and cords off of your project. Replace your paper when it stops cutting. You don't want a penny pinch here. Time is money, and it's going to take you a lot more time with dull paper to finish your project. Only wet sand the areas you know you're going to be able to get with your buffer. Tape up any trim or chrome as needed. And here it is. The whole front end is completely color sanded and buffed out. There's quite a bit of a reflection in here, especially compared to before. It has a little bit of orange peel that I wanted, so that gave it more of a factory look. This isn't supposed to be a show vehicle. So now I'm going to end this video the same way I started the video. And that is, if you purchased a vehicle and the paint looks terrible, if it has orange peel or some surface scratching, something that you can cut and buff, then now you know that it is possible to do it. Also, if you want to get your car painted but you can't afford a really nice paint job, you can always go and get a cheap paint job, and as long as there's enough material on your vehicle, you can cut and buff it for just the price of these materials and a lot of elbow grease. So I hope this was helpful, and if it was, hit the like button. Also hit the subscribe for more videos coming soon. Make sure to check on the channel and see if there's anything that I've already done that might be helpful as well. And lastly, go check out radtimecustoms.com. There's a link in the description. I've got t-shirts, I have decals, a couple other small things, more things coming. So check with that. If there's anything you like, go and scoop it up. Take your keys off.